A chilling warning from Benjamin. Netanyahu was meant to silence his critics and intimidate his opponents. Instead, it triggered a thunderous counterattack from one of Africa's youngest and boldest leaders, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. What unfolded wasn't just a clash of statements. It was a collision of worldviews, a direct challenge to the old order, and a moment that revealed the shifting balance of global power. If you thought the front line of geopolitical struggle was in the Middle East, think again, because now Africa's voice is breaking through the noise, demanding to be heard, and Traoré is making sure the world cannot ignore him. Netanyahu framed his warning as final, decisive, the language of a man certain of his authority. But Traoré's counterattack cut through the rhetoric with raw defiance. He didn't just push back, he reframed the entire debate. While Netanyahu invoked survival and defense, Traoré spoke of dignity, sovereignty, and liberation. Where one man leaned on decades of entrenched power, the other summoned the rising energy of a continent tired of being lectured, bullied, and controlled. This wasn't a simple war of words. It was a generational confrontation, old guard versus new guard, empire versus emancipation. To understand the weight of Traoré's counterattack, you need to know the man behind the words. At just 35 years old, Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in Burkina Faso not through polished speeches or decades of bureaucracy, but through decisive action. A military officer turned head of state, he became the youngest leader in the world when his country turned to him in a moment of chaos. But unlike so many before him, he didn't adopt the role of a placeholder or caretaker. He claimed it with a mission to end foreign interference, to confront terrorism head-on, and to restore pride to a people battered by decades of exploitation. That context matters because when Traoré speaks, he doesn't sound like a diplomat repeating tired cliches. He sounds like a man on a mission, someone who sees himself as part of history's turning point. Netanyahu's warning was designed to project inevitability, Israel's survival at all costs, no matter what it takes. But Traoré responded with a sharp reminder that survival means nothing if it comes at the cost of humanity. His words carried a different kind of weight, not backed by nuclear arsenals or billion-dollar defense budgets, but by moral clarity. He framed Netanyahu's warning not as strength, but as desperation. And in that contrast, Traoré did something extraordinary. He placed Africa on equal footing in a conversation usually dominated by superpowers. The power of his counterattack comes from its framing. Traoré didn't simply oppose Netanyahu point by point. Instead, he zoomed out and exposed the wider narrative. He argued that what Netanyahu called defense was in reality domination, that what he labeled war was in fact oppression, and that warnings meant to silence were instead calls to awaken. He flipped the script, and in doing so, he turned a defensive warning into an indictment of a whole system of global double standards. That's why his words landed so hard. They weren't just about Israel or Palestine. They were about Africa, about the global South, about every nation that has lived under the shadow of someone else's power. Think about the setting. Netanyahu's stage is often the global podium, the UN, high-profile interviews, international press conferences. He's used to being amplified without challenge. But Traoré's voice rises from Ouagadougou, from a nation that Western media often dismisses as peripheral. And yet, that's exactly why his words resonate. They remind people that truth doesn't need a polished stage. It only needs conviction. In a world where media headlines are carefully curated, a defiant voice from a so-called small country can shake the entire table. And that's exactly what happened here. What makes Traoré's message different is the emotional appeal. Netanyahu's language is rooted in fear, fear of annihilation, fear of enemies closing in. It's the language of someone trying to justify perpetual war. Traoré's counterattack is rooted in pride and defiance. It's the language of someone saying, enough. Enough of foreign armies deciding our fate. Enough of leaders using fear as currency. Enough of a global hierarchy where some lives are defended with everything and others are written off as collateral damage. He took Netanyahu's final warning and answered with Africa's final refusal to be treated as disposable. The contrast is powerful. Netanyahu invokes history wars survived, enemies defeated, resilience in the face of destruction. Traoré invokes destiny, a future where Africa writes its own story, where the young rise against the weight of centuries, where nations once patronized now stand as equals. One speaks from the past, the other from the future. And in that contrast, viewers feel the turning of an age. But there's more. Traoré knows his audience isn't just in Burkina Faso. His counterattack was aimed at the global south, at the millions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America who feel the sting of double standards every time a Western leader speaks of justice but delivers only bombs and sanctions. He knows young people across the continent are listening. People who are tired of poverty, tired of corruption, tired of leaders bowing to foreign powers. By standing up to Netanyahu, Traoré wasn't just answering one man. He was giving voice to a generation ready to rise, and that's why his counterattack spread so quickly online. Clips of his statements circulated not because mainstream broadcasters highlighted them, but because ordinary people shared them, clipped them, translated them. It became digital wildfire, proof that in today's world, a message doesn't need the blessing of CNN or the BBC to reach millions. All it needs is truth spoken boldly enough that people feel compelled to pass it on. Of course, critics dismissed Traoré's words as reckless, as populist, as inflammatory. But here's the irony. Those same critics never asked whether Netanyahu's final warning was reckless. They never questioned whether decades of perpetual war and occupation are themselves inflammatory. This is the double standard Traoré called out. And it's why his counterattack hit so hard. It didn't just challenge a statement. It challenged the system that decides which voices get branded responsible and which get dismissed. At the heart of his response was a single question. Who decides whose survival matters more? Netanyahu's framing assumes that Israel's survival is unquestionable, an absolute good, regardless of cost. Traoré pushed back. What about the survival of Palestine? What about the survival of Africa, constantly undermined by external powers? What about the survival of nations treated as pawns in games they never chose to play? By asking those questions, he reframed the entire conversation. Suddenly, Netanyahu wasn't the unquestioned defender of survival, he was part of the problem. Part of a system that decides whose survival is negotiable and whose isn't. The storytelling in Traoré's counterattack is deliberate. He casts himself and his people as the underdog, standing against overwhelming power but refusing to bow. He uses the imagery of chains breaking, of a continent rising, of dignity reclaimed. And unlike Netanyahu's framing, which traps people in endless cycles of fear, Traoré offers a vision, a future where nations stand equal, where youth take control of their destiny, where survival isn't just about clinging to power, but about living with honor. That's why people listen, because he doesn't just describe a problem, he paints a path forward. Make no mistake, this isn't just rhetoric. Traoré's counterattack reflects a deeper realignment happening across Africa. Countries are expelling foreign troops, reclaiming resources, rewriting alliances. The Sahel region, long painted as unstable and dependent, is becoming a laboratory for a new form of independence. By publicly clashing with Netanyahu, Traoré linked Africa's struggle for sovereignty with global struggles against domination. He connected dots many leaders are too afraid to acknowledge. And in doing so, he carved out a place for himself not just as Burkina Faso's leader, but as a global voice of defiance. The stakes of this confrontation go far beyond words. Netanyahu represents an established order backed by decades of alliances, weapons, and unquestioned legitimacy in Western capitals. Traoré represents a rising countercurrent, one fueled not by firepower, but by moral outrage and youthful determination. When those two forces collide, the result is unpredictable. But one thing is clear. Silence is no longer an option. The world must now pay attention. And so, when Netanyahu issued his final war warning, perhaps he expected fear, perhaps he expected silence. Instead, he got something else. A young African leader refusing to bow, refusing to be quiet, refusing to let history repeat itself without resistance. Ibrahim Traoré turned a warning into an awakening. And for millions watching around the world, it felt like the beginning of something new. But what makes Traoré's counterattack so powerful is not just what he said, but what it represents. It's a signal flare in a dark sky, a message that the global South is no longer content to play supporting roles in a script written elsewhere. For decades, African leaders were expected to echo the lines handed to them, calls for stability, cooperation, and silence on the contradictions of the global order. Traoré broke that pattern. His refusal to bow to Netanyahu's rhetoric was more than defiance. It was a declaration that Africa is not a silent continent, but a rising force, ready to shape the conversations that decide the fate of nations. The reaction has been telling. Across African capitals, Traoré's words were replayed in youth forums, in campus debates, in conversations between activists and ordinary citizens. For them, his counterattack wasn't just a geopolitical clash. It was personal. It echoed their frustrations with leaders who compromise dignity for aid packages, who trade sovereignty for temporary security guarantees. When Traoré stood tall against Netanyahu's warning, he embodied the courage they want from their own governments. That resonance explains why his speech spread so fast and struck such a chord. And yet, this clash isn't only about Africa. By challenging Netanyahu, Traoré stepped directly into one of the most heated conflicts in global politics. Israel's war policies are not just domestic choices. They are international flashpoints, shaping alliances, fueling debates, and defining how power is exercised in the 21st century. For an African leader to speak into that space, to counter one of the most entrenched voices in global politics, is to demand a seat at the table where the future is negotiated. It's a claim that Africa cannot be ignored, not when questions of justice and survival are on the line. This is why the counterattack matters for people outside Africa as well. In Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East, there is a growing hunger for voices that cut through the hypocrisy of established powers. Netanyahu speaks the language of inevitability, wars that must be fought, enemies that must be crushed, sacrifices that must be made. Traoré speaks the language of refusal, the refusal to accept that domination is natural, the refusal to believe that survival for some must come at the destruction of others. That contrast resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. It resonates with anyone who has felt the weight of inequality, who has seen their community treated as collateral in someone else's war. Critics will argue that Traoré is overreaching, that Burkina Faso is too small, too fragile, too embattled to challenge someone like Netanyahu. But that is precisely why his words matter. Because power is not just measured in missiles and markets. It's measured in influence, in the ability to inspire, in the courage to say what others are afraid to voice. History is full of moments when so-called small nations reshaped the global conversation. Vietnam did it, Cuba did it, South Africa did it. Now Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, is daring to do the same. And here's the deeper point. Netanyahu's final warning was meant to end debate, to close the door, to silence dissent. Traoré's counterattack reopened it, wider than ever. He reminded the world that no warning, no matter how final it sounds, can erase the demand for dignity and justice. That's why people shared his words, why they trended online, why they reached audiences that official channels never intended them to reach. It wasn't just what he said, it was the act of saying it, of refusing silence. The story is far from over. Netanyahu will issue more statements. He will stand on bigger stages, backed by powerful allies. But Traoré has shown that even from Ouagadougou, a leader can pierce through the noise, unsettle the narrative, and plant a seed of doubt in the global conscience. That seed is dangerous to the old order, because once people realize that truth doesn't always come from the loudest voices, they begin to listen differently. They begin to question. They begin to demand more. So when history looks back on this moment, it may not remember the exact phrasing of Netanyahu's warning, nor the precise wording of Traoré's reply. What it will remember is the confrontation itself, the sight of a young African leader standing tall, answering a veteran statesman not with fear, but with fire. That image, that memory, will inspire others. It will remind young leaders across the world that they don't have to wait decades to be heard. They don't need the approval of superpowers to speak truth. They only need courage, and maybe that's the real power of Traoré's counterattack. Not the words themselves, but the permission they give others to rise. Because when one voice dares to defy, it makes space for countless others to do the same. And when enough voices join together, no warning, no matter how final, can drown them out. This isn't just about Traoré. It isn't just about Netanyahu. It's about the tectonic shifts of our time, young against old, south against north, the silenced against the powerful. And in those shifts, one thing is clear: the world is changing. The counterattack has begun. If this story matters to you, don't just watch and move on. Add your voice. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth. And make sure you subscribe with the notification bell on. Because when leaders dare to stand up against the old order, it's on us to amplify their voices. Mainstream outlets may stay silent, but together we can make sure the message spreads. The more we share, the harder it becomes for anyone to ignore.